I'm delighted to introduce Celia Holman, who's a former children's publisher, and I was just asking her before, you know, what books did you get involved in? And I was wondering what she would say, and she said she was the main editorial director for the children's book, The Gruffalo. Whoa, there we are.
I feel I've peaked early.
So that's fascinating. And she is also a long-time resident and a TV producer and a long-time resident of Eel Pie. And so tonight she's going to be talking about the riverside in Twickenham, but also the blowing of the edges into Richmond as well. And she's, as well as being an expert on the riverside where she gives tours, she's also an oral historian, getting involved in a major oral history project to do with the working experiences of London. I think, over the last 7 or 8 years, is that right?
Yes, it's an ongoing project.
So they will have seen a lot of changes then in the way people are working.
Absolutely, and that's what we're trying to capture, those moments of change.
So please welcome Celia.
Thank you so much. Good evening. There's some really interesting publications down there. I've literally picked one up and I'm going to be reading a couple of paragraphs. I'm going to incorporate it into my presentation. It's the 2001, if you're interested. Right, well, thank you so much for coming along tonight. I'm going to start with a map from 1635, and this is Twickenham, or Twickenham, as you can see it, vulgarly called. Those little stars are going to be where we're going to jump around on our journey, our slide-by-slide trip around Twickenham Riverside. Before I start, we're going to do a little bit of audience participation, just to see the knowledge bank in the room. Any offers as to what I'm going to be talking about with the pink star at the top, just outside of central Twickenham? A famous poet. Pope's, yes, Pope's Villa. Well, Pope's Grotto. There's not much of the villa left, but we'll talk about that. Massive prizes if anyone can tell me what the red star is. Do you know, yes, before the open-air swimming pool. I beg your pardon? Can you give a name to it? Right. Well, this house had many, many residents, and this is one of my nods towards Richmond House, which was a massive house in the centre of Twickenham. Any offers for the yellow star? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And then one of Twickenham's landmarks on the riverside, the purple star is? Somebody said Naked Ladies. Yes, they are a landmark, but we're going to keep the tone high just for now. No? Somebody said the church. St. Mary's Church. And then if we skip along to the blue star. Orleans, absolutely. And then finally our green star. Hamilton's Ferry. Do you know the front row are very good? They're the teacher swats at the front. Right, let's click along. Hamilton's Ferry. It's not where we're starting, it's where we're ending, but this presentation is dedicated to the memory of Francis Spencer, the long-time ferryman at Hamilton's Ferry, who passed away in 2020. His son, Andy, did a 365-day swim. Every day I watched him swim past the bottom of my garden in all weathers, raising money for charity. It's also an excuse to put that rather nice photograph up. So well done, Andy. So we're going to start with this map. Everything that you see ringed or named in red is no longer there, all been demolished. And a little bit of this talk will be a history of demolition, but also of preservation. And you can see that lots of the areas of the riverside that we know, these former great estates have given their names. As you can see, St Margaret's, Cambridge Park, Crossdeep, and so forth. that just to kind of orient you a little bit in this slide, the green star is Hamilton's Ferry, and this little purple star, any offers as to what that little purple star is? No, it's where we are now. Yeah? So, Duke Street. So moving along, or rather just pausing here, all of these grand houses on the bank of the Thames between Richmond and Twickenham. The land between Kew and Richmond had largely been bagsied by the kind of, old establishment families. There weren't a lot of places where if you were an aspiring Londoner and you wanted a sort of semi-country seat within striking distance of central London where you could build a house. So these were all grand houses that were the equivalent of you could get a coach and horses and you wouldn't have to change your horses between central London and your house here. So the fashionable Twickenham continues. Ladies and gentlemen, from the Times, but a couple of weeks ago. There you go. You think it's all happening in Richmond, I invite you to cross the bridge into what is known as East Twickenham now, but I have heard a rumour it's to be rebranded Richmond Bridge Village. Oh, controversial. Oh, they don't like that. They don't like that, honestly. The rabble is rousing already. Right, let's get back to it. Pope's Villa, Pope's Grotto, up there. This is the most amazing painting. You can see this in Orleans Gallery, and we'll be visiting Orleans House Gallery later on. It's just the most beautiful picture. And you can see I put a little pink star above Pope's Villa there, the red star above Richmond House. You can see St Mary's Church on the outskirts and Eel Pie Island marked with a yellow star. And you can see the combination of, the workers pulling the barges and the gentry at ease. And so here we are. Alexander Pope moved to Twickenham in 1714, an early adopter, if you like, of this increasingly fashionable part of outer London's riverside. The grotto then, the grotto now, not much has changed. It's not open very often to the public because we'll see where it's situated later on, but I do encourage you to visit and also look at the website that Pope's Grotto has set up. There's a really amazing animation in there showing somebody kind of rowing. It's rather well done. When you look at this picture here, you can see these people arriving. You might think they were kind of Pope's friends. He probably didn't know them. Large houses in those days were sort of open to the public. People would turn up, sometimes by appointment, sometimes not. This is the entrance to the grotto. Does anyone know why Pope built the grotto? What was the reason for it? I beg your pardon? To get to the other side of the road, absolutely. Because there's the road behind the house, and he'd taken a lease on the land behind, and that was where his garden was. The house was so popular with visitors that even after Pope died, it continued to be visited. And a subsequent owner got so annoyed with being plagued by visitors that she pulled down the house, built another house, and then somebody else bought the site, and they built this house. This house dates from, the images from 1873. It was built sometime in the mid-1800s. And the person who built this house had made their money through a particular product that one drinks. If you have a look at the house, there's a little clue there. Any thoughts as to what consumable product? Tea, absolutely. So that's a kind of a nod to a sort of tea caddy, a little bit of chinoiserie, if you like. The house, and there's the grotto, as you can see there, the entrance was kept. The house was expanded subsequently. And then it was completely subsumed into what you see now. So this house, the house here, you can see it in the middle there, And then these buildings were added. It was a convent for a long time, and then it subsequently became a couple of private schools, and it's now Radnor House School. We're now going to skip along the riverside into central Twickenham to Richmond House. But before we do that, some views of Twickenham's riverside. St Mary's Church, always visible. All of the kind of watermen and lightermen's huts and little riverside warehouses. In contrast to Richmond, Twickenham was always a working town. It had those watermen and lightermen plying their trade in a way that didn't happen so much at Richmond. And you can see also working barges, Thames River barges there as well. And there's another not dissimilar view of the riverside. I've highlighted on there a wall that runs along the front of the riverside, and that is the wall of Richmond House, which I put a little star on there. Unbelievably, this is the only image of Richmond House in existence. This vast house in the centre of Twickenham is only recorded in this view from 1725. And there's a very blurry enlargement of it. It was built at a not dissimilar time to Ham House, but unlike Ham House that was occupied by the Dysarts for centuries until it passed to the National Trust, I think in the 1940s, Richmond House was lived in by a succession of tenants, if you like, and owners. It was sort of like a bit of a buy-to-let project, if you like, over the years. The house was eventually demolished in 1820, or about 1816, and then this house was built in its place. And this house was built because the lady who had inherited the house, her cousin, lived along the river in Riverside House, which is just next to Orleans Gallery. And she thought, gosh, I rather like the look of your house. So she pulled down Richmond House and built that one instead. And you can see here, this is an ordnance survey from the turn of the century, 1900. And that was the site that Richmond House occupied. It had large walls. It had large walls running down here along the high street and down here, and then a lower wall there. It very much enclosed and dominated central Twickenham for many years. I put a little red arrow showing the wall there. That pub, the George, is still there. It says London Road, but it's not London Road. And there, just a view switching round, and you can see the erstwhile Barclays Bank that was built, I think 1901, in the background there. And there's the wall to Richmond, one of the walls to Richmond House. The yellow star in this image from 1949 is where this previous image, approximately where the person who created that image would have been standing when they created that. The Barclays Bank is just out of sight, and we can see what has appeared by 1949. I think somebody mentioned it, the swimming pool. That was built in 1931 and closed in the early 1980s, never to reopen again, more of that later. It was built as a place of public washing. It was the baths and swimming pool. So the population of Twickenham had exploded, as indeed the population of London in very many boroughs, but especially in Twickenham. In 1800, the population of Twickenham was some 3,000. By 1900, it was 21,000. And people needed places to wash. So in the 1930s, in the 1920s rather, there were several bathing houses where you could take your family along and give them a bath. And so this building here had actually bathing, washing, body washing facilities in there. This is an image from 1949. There's a wonderful website called Britain from Above, and do check it out. It's got loads of these aerial photographs that were like aerial surveys that were taken there's, ones from, mid-1920s, 1930s, and then 1949 is especially interesting because it's just after the Second World War, and those two arrows there, I'm showing you some bomb damage on Twickenham's riverside. In fact, when a bomb hit here, it killed one of the Hamiltons, and we'll be talking about the Hamiltons. We've touched on them lightly already, but we'll feature them more later. My arrow there is pointing to something that's not there. What is not there that is there now? The bridge to Eel Pie Island, absolutely. So the swimming pool from the swimming baths and the bathing facilities from the embankment, those buildings were demolished in the early 2000s. I love that picture there. I put a little star showing St Mary's Church. It's been kind of photobombing images of Twickenham for the past, several centuries. And then the contrast between the 1960s and the 1990s, because of course the pool closed in 1981, never to reopen. But it did have another incarnation as the Diamond Jubilee Gardens, these popular riverside gardens, which have now closed. And every single tree that you literally, with the exception of those trees back there, which are actually in Thames 8, an adjoining site, every single tree that you can see in those photographs have now been felled. To make way for the future, the Twickenham Riverside development. I put a star on the Barclays Bank, the former Barclays Bank, and that yellow star is the bottom of Water Lane, just to give you an idea of where we are on the riverside. So back to that aerial photograph there. We're now going to zoom down to this, where I put the blue arrow at the bottom of Water Lane, and we're going to continue our walk along the riverside. This image is at the bottom of Wharf Lane, or as it was known then, Oil Mill Lane, and is looking back towards Twickenham's riverside. And as you can see, it's got a natural foreshore. An image some 50 years later, you've still got the natural foreshore. The yellow star is the bottom of Water Lane, and there's one of the walls of Richmond House that you can see there. And then all the working boats and the kind of riverside warehouses and huts for the watermen and the lightermen. By 1890, so some 10 years after this photograph, this is what Twickenham's embankment looked like. By 1880 rather, this image is from 1890, by 1880 it had all been embanked. Why was the Thames being embanked? Well, a couple of reasons really. Well, one of them was the river was running out of water. There had been London Bridge, old London Bridge, had been demolished in the 1830s, and it had acted as a kind of weir, so that when the tide went out, it never really fully went out. So kind of upriver from the old London Bridge, a lot of water, which otherwise would have flowed out, was kept there. So when that went in 1830, you started to get kind of lower tides. And the consequence of lower tides was that boats couldn't move as easily. The other thing that was happening was the population of London was exploding, and lots of water companies were just dragging water out of the Thames. So the embanking of the Thames started to happen in central London and moved out in order to create a narrower channel so that the reduced amount of water could be used more efficiently by boats going backwards and forwards. Somebody else who used the water at Twickenham's riverside was this gentleman, Charlie Shaw. Charlie Shaw was apprenticed to one of the Hamiltons as a young man. And what Charlie Shaw, there's his boathouse at the bottom of Water Lane. That boathouse was knocked down by Richmond Council in the 1930s. And that house was knocked down by Hitler in the 1940s. And it was the bomb that landed on that house that killed one of the Hamiltons. So Charlie Shaw was well known in Twickenham for setting up the Boys and Girls Regatta. That's an image taken from Eel Pie Island, looking back to, there's Water Lane and the boathouse and the White House there. And there's the view from the slipway on Twickenham's riverside, and you can see the name Hamerton there. And then in my next slide, you can see the name Hamerton there as well. So the Hamertons really did dominate Twickenham's riverside for many, many decades. The bottom photograph is a view from the slipway at the bottom of Water Lane, looking towards Eel Pie Island. It's exactly, when you go over the bridge to Eel Pie Island, the bridge is here, and these railings are still there. And if you look carefully under the bridge, you can see the remnants of those steps as well. But this part of Twickenham was very much a place of leisure. It was where you could rent a little skiff or a wherry and go out on the river. The image at the top is one of the last images of the Eel Pie Island ferry in operation. There you can see those railings that I just pointed out to you. I used to, up until, about a year ago, I used to be able to point to this little girl here and say her name is Sue, and Sue still lives on Eel Pie Island. Unfortunately, Sue passed away about a year ago, but it's nice to show this photograph of her nonetheless. The people in the photograph down here are the Duke and Duchess of York. That's the future George VI, and they are on the ferry, the ferry to Eel Pie Island. And why are they going to Eel Pie Island? They're going to the Twickenham Rowing Club. The Twickenham Rowing Club is one of the largest and oldest rowing clubs on the River Thames, founded by the Duc d'Aumale, who was the sixth son, which is a very difficult thing to say, sixth son of Louis-Philippe I of France. What was he doing in Twickenham? Well, the French royal family were in and out of Twickenham through a lot of the 1800s. You know, in exile, coming back, whatever. And if you don't have a country to rule, you need to amuse yourself somehow, so you set up a rowing club, which is what they did. Moving on to Eel Pie Island, there's the bridge, built in 1957, and the bridge has a name. Does anybody know what the bridge to Eel Pie Island is called officially? It's called Snapper's Bridge. And the reason why it's called Snapper's Bridge, because it was built by the gentleman Michael Snapper, who had bought the Eel Pie Island Hotel in 1951. And the music club had started to get popular. And initially, people had to go over on the ferry. But Michael Snapper thought, well, I'll get more bums on seats if I build a bridge. So he was a very modest man. He called it Snapper's Bridge. And he was a very generous man. It was a toll bridge. So everybody, you had to pay to go over the bridge, and then you had to pay to go to the club. The bridge that you see now over to Eel Pie Island is not the original bridge, because in this photograph here, here's some people kind of protesting because the bridge has been broken by British Gas. They attached a gas pipe to it, and in doing so, damaged the structure of the bridge. I've put an arrow next to a gentleman standing up. Any offers as to who that gentleman is? It is Vince Cable. And I include that photograph because it's a very rare photograph of Vince Cable not in a high-vis jacket. Yes? I'm going to be logging that in the Metropolitan Archives, which are now the London Archives, I think. Anyway, there's our current bridge being floated in. And it was inserted, it was put in place using the power of the moon. Any offers? Oh, you're so good. You said they'd be a bit slower, but they're quite good. Yes. So at high tide, you position it, and then as the tide goes out, it drops down. So the bridge now is actually owned by everybody on the island. So when I bought my house on the island, I got a little kind of share certificate saying that I, had one share in the bridge, and it was very attractive. And before I'd even framed it, I was so excited, the bugger sent me a bill because we have to share all the costs, all the maintenance and the insurance and so forth. But the biggest cost, what do you think our biggest annual cost on that bridge is? And it's tens of thousands of pounds a year. No? No? Sorry? No, although we should charge for people to go over on open studios, you're absolutely right. It's our Port of London Authority licence. Because these are tidal waters, so they're Port of London Authority waters, and anything that, you can imagine anything that sits in the water has to pay a license, but actually anything that projects over the water, even if it doesn't touch the water, is subject to a license. And when you look at Eel Pie Island, every pole, every pontoon, every buoy floating in the river is subject to a license. You're looking at possibly, I would imagine it's a six-figure sum just around the island. The hotel that I mentioned, there it is, freshly built in 1830. There'd been an inn on that site since at least the early 1600s. And there's an early photograph, obviously St. Mary's Church in the background. The hotel was on the far side of the island, and there's the hotel gardens. I live on the site of the hotel, and when people when I say that to people, I think they imagine that I live in a house that big. My house is approximately the equivalent of those two windows. So this lady is actually sitting in my back garden, and every time I have a gin and tonic in my back garden, I think of people who have enjoyed who have imbibed before me. And the people who imbibed before me largely came to Eel Pie Island on pleasure steamers, and there you can see one such steamer arriving at Eel Pie Island from the early 1800s onwards. This was a sort of a day trip. It was pretty much as far as you could get, spend a day and get back from central London. Ooh, my clicker has stopped. I'm going to carry on talking about this image. They might have to reboot me. So, on those steamers would have left from Westminster Pier. And at that pier, there would have been lots of people calling out names of, do you want to go to Hampton Court or Kew or this, that, and the other. And we think that was where the name Eel Pie Island, oh, there we go, Eel Pie Island came from. That it was a name that the island was renamed Eel Pie Island to make it memorable for people coming on the steamers. And it was named thus because Henry VIII supposedly ate eel pies there. I can answer more questions about that if you're interested. Anyway, to continue, here we have some of those day trippers, all dressed up, coming from the East End of London to Eel Pie Island. It was a huge success, so much so that a ballroom was built in the late 1800s next door to the hotel, and it was that ballroom where the club was. By the late 1960s, the hotel had become a bit of a squat. The lovely ballroom ended up like that, and this bloke appeared. Yeah, so the Rolling Stones were the house band of 1963. Every Wednesday evening from May to September, you could see the Rolling Stones. When they took on that engagement, they hadn't released a single yet. If you want to know more, go to the Eel Pie Island Museum in central Twickenham. You can find so much more a lot about the musical history. And do visit the island on Eel Pie Island Open Studio. Somebody mentioned that earlier. Typically the last weekend of June and the first weekend of July. You can go onto the island anytime you want, but you can just go over the bridge and walk down the path. At Open Studios, you can go into the boat yards and have a good old nosy around. So do take the opportunity to have a visit if you haven't already. Back to the riverside, an aerial view of Twickenham in 1920. It was pretty much slumland at that point, very, very densely occupied. And you can see that there was a lot of slum clearance during the 1950s and 60s. This is an aerial view now, and you can see large areas were cleared out. Mainly, it would appear, for car parking. But a lot remains. It's really worth going down to Twickenham Riverside and having a poke around all the little lanes. Those are D'Aumale cottages, so named after the Duc d'Aumale, who founded the rowing club. This image shows you what some of the houses looked like in the 1930s. These were all HMOs, houses of multiple occupancy. In the foreground, I know it's a bit blurry, there's somebody sitting on the floor, and that is actually a child next to them, you know, barefooted and so forth. And that's what those houses look like now. Sebastian Coe lived there, and Pete Townsend used to live there. So from slums to des res. All of this was due to be pulled down in the 1930s, but was saved by the Embankment Preservation Society. In the 1950s, it was the turn of Church Street to get knocked down. But fortunately, Sir John Betjeman intervened. You know, all of his, you know, the wrecking balls of, you know, the wrecking balls that were going through England. And so Church Street, you know, largely looks how it did back then. When you go down Church Street, do take the opportunity to look up and look between the shops. You can find lots of original detail there. St Mary's Church, there it is. There's been a church on that site since about the 13th century. That tower dates from the 1400s, but the main part of the red brick church is from the 1720s, when the rest of the church fell down. And there you can see the church with the vicarage in the foreground and more of those kind of watermen's huts on the riverside. Slightly later on, you can see a building that's been built there. We're going to talk about that in a moment, another riverside wharf. Inside St Mary's Church is absolutely beautiful, and it's used a lot for filming. And there was one thing that was filmed there in just before lockdown. It was 2019, and it was all very secretive, and it said it's an untitled Netflix project, and nobody was allowed to know what it was, and there was masses of vans and all of this. And then during lockdown, the vestry were very excited to find out that this particular program had been filmed there, and wrote to everybody who was involved with the church and said, you must tune in. The church is featured on this show. Now, it's a whole new category of program. I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up and say who's seen it, but I would classify that, I used to work in television, and I would say that is heritage porn. That's the, you know, a rare photograph of the characters fully clothed. So next to St Mary's Church, you can see this building here, which is there to this day. It's a former almshouse. It was built in the 1870s by St Mary's Church for the poor of Twickenham. And it's now the Richmond Shakespeare Society. There you go, I got another mention of Richmond in. I mean, I'm doing really well. It's not just about Shakespeare. It shows lots of shows. There are many different types of performances in there, and it's a really lovely theatre to go and visit, a lovely intimate space. So, you know, do take the opportunity to visit there. This is a view from St Mary's Church Tower. It's open once a year if you fancy. It's a lot of steps, looking down onto Eel Pie Island and onto the site of a riverside wharf here. Look at the tree cover. It's absolutely stunning, isn't it? That's another nod to the Richmond side of the bank. And in the foreshore of where that warehouse is about to be built, you can see these Thames barges able to take the ground at low tide. And this is the warehouse that was built there. It was only there for about 60 years, and it stored coal and grain for Twickenham's brewing industry. It's now a lovely park to the memory of any offers as to who's being remembered in this garden? Alexander Pope. And it's a beautiful place to go and sit. It's like a raised garden area overlooking the riverside. Moving along to Dial House next door. There it is. And there's an aerial view. There's Dial House. There's St Mary's Church and the riverside, the rowing club, the bridge to Eel Pie Island. It's called Dial House because it has a sundial on the front, but because it doesn't face south, it's a rather unusual design of sundial. And you can see there Thomas Twining Thomas Twining bought the house in the or rather he bought two houses on the site and then rebuilt and combined them and made his house. Thomas Twining had set up his company in the early 1700s, initially as a coffee house, because that's what everybody was drinking before they drank tea. And then he became famous for his blends of tea. It stayed in the Twining family until the late 1800s, when Elizabeth Twining died and left it to St Mary's Church, and it became the vicarage, and it's now the sort of summer residence of the Bishop of Kensington, or rather was. It's on the market. I don't know whether it's sold or not. I think if you've got £3.5 million, it can be yours, yes? Where are we going to now on the riverside? Yes, I think. Yes, York House. I'm going to canter along here because I need to finish in about 10 minutes, don't I? So we're going to canter down the riverside. So York House, which is now the seat of power of the London Borough of Richmond-upon-Thames. And if you look at going back to Glover in 1635, I put a little arrow where York House is. And that's a bit blurry, that image, but what Glover has drawn there is scaffolding, because it's being built as he draws his map. And there's another aerial view with York House in the middle. It was bought in 1897 by this gentleman, the Duc d'Orléans. He had been born in that house in the 1860s. It had been rented by the French royal family at various times over the years as they were coming and going. And the York House that we see today is very much the product of the Duc d'Orléans' purchase in 1897. He built all of this extension here. And you can see here he built a swimming bath. Now, where is that swimming bath in York House? We'll get to it in a moment, but rather controversially, he created this riverside garden here, because there is this road here called Riverside, and that's a doomsday right-of-way. And you find a lot of the houses have their riverside gardens the other side of a road. So what the Duc d'Orléans did was he took this meadow, which had been enjoyed by the people of Twickenham for many years, for centuries, and he built walls around it, and accessed it. It's where the naked ladies are now. He didn't put the naked ladies in. And he had to access it via a bridge. But he put all these walls in. Didn't make himself very popular at all. So much so that he left Twickenham in 1900 and took with him some rather nice gates he'd put on York House. And York House sat empty until 1906. He'd also built this little boathouse for himself, which is the Twickenham Yacht Club. But this gentleman came up and bought the house in 1906. Any offers as to his name? Ratan Tata, absolutely. And these are some images from the catalogue when Ratan Tata bought the house. And if you look here, here's the swimming pool, which was a raised swimming pool. And it's now, when you go into Clarendon Hall, there's a stage in Clarendon Hall, and it's still there if you lift the kind of floor of the stage. And when I came onto this stage here tonight, I could see these there's trap doors here, and I thought, somebody's going to open the trap door if I overrun. But what we've got in here, this is where people get baptized. So it's it's a little bit like the Duc d'Orléans swimming bath. Moving along the riverside, going past Zion Row, which is the most beautiful terrace of houses, built as sort of Airbnbs in the early 1700s. It's where you could, rent the house for the summer and come to the ever increasingly fashionable Twickenham. This is what the riverside looks like. Zion Row is just over here, and that's what it looks like now. It hasn't really changed, has it? The White Swan pub. Another little view of the riverside. And yes, just like at Richmond, where you can go to the White Cross pub and get cut off by the tide, you can do it in Twickenham too. And what I've marked with a little yellow star there is a ferry hut. And the ferry hut's still there to this day. The ferry closed, I think it was like the 1980s, and it was called the Twickenham ferry, but it was the Earl of Dysart's ferry. And of course, we know Dysart in Ham, and we're going to talk about a little bit more about ferries in a moment. And you can see the ferryman's cottage next door. This has flipped the image. We're now looking at Eel Pie Island. There's the ferryman operating. There's the ferryman's house. And there's this really large house. Does anybody know the name of this large house? Is this the front row? Oh, it's the row back. This is such a good corner over here. I'm going to go over here. So, Mount Lebanon House, an absolutely enormous house that was built in the late 1800s on the site of another house. It had 41 rooms, and what was interesting about it, it had a massive 7-acre garden going all the way back to the Richmond Road. It was a really sizable house. It was bought by a gentleman called William Cunard in 1897 of the Cunard shipping family. And we're going to meet him a couple of times in the next couple of minutes. And he bought it as a speculative property investment, sold off the gardens, and you can see in this photograph from about 1905, you can see there's already houses being built here. And those are the houses of Lebanon Park. It was called Mount Lebanon because there were lots of cedar trees in the garden. Next door, Orleans House. Finally, we've got there. And there's the house was built in 1710, the octagon room in 1720, and then this connecting building was built slightly later on. This image that we're looking at now is the French royal family making a return visit in the mid-1800s. I mean, it's called Orleans House, but the Duke d'Orléans lived there for about 5 years in sort of 1810 to 1815. It was bought by William Cunard in 1882, and he actually lived there. And while he was living there, he was keeping his eye out what was coming on the market elsewhere. And after he died, it passed into various hands, and it ended up in the hands of the Crane River Sand and Ballast Company, who literally overnight demolished the main house and the connecting building. At which point, this lady stepped in, Nellie Ionides, who was a Shell heiress, and she lived next door in Riverside House. And so she bought Orleans House from the gravel company. The gravel extraction continued for another 10 years. And then when she died in the 1960s, she bequeathed it to the borough, and it houses the borough's art collection now. And she had lots of dogs, all named after Grand Marque champagnes. That's Veuve Clicquot, in case you were wondering. We're now going to swing up to Richmond Hill. We're getting closer to home, ladies and gentlemen, for our finale. And the view down from Richmond Hill. And what's nestling in the trees there that we cannot see? What grand house? Exactly, Marble Hill House. And there's that view from 1749, a Palladian villa. I won't tell you too much about Marble House, except to say that it's still free to enter. Yes, it got loads of National Lottery money, so they had to make it free for several years. This might be the last year that it's free, so do go along if you're not a member of English Heritage. And there's the woman who commissioned that house, Henrietta Howard, who had a relationship with the Prince of Wales, later George II. You can see Marble House here in the background. This is an image from the early 1900s. It had been bought by, guess who, William Cunard in 1898. And he's got building plans yet again. There's a road that's been built, ready for all of this land to be developed for housing, at which point the people of Twickenham and Richmond as well kind of, got together. There was public money, there was private money, and the park was bought and became a public park. And there you can see people enjoying bit of tennis, lots of sheep, now replaced by lots of dogs. And this image here, Marble Hill House, ringed in the middle. Any offers as to what we're looking at here? This is an image from 1944. I'm moving away from this side. Oh, this side is just as good. Yes, allotments, because everyone's digging for victory. And that little star there is none other than Hamerton's Ferry. So Hamerton's Ferry was not always a ferry. Walter Hamerton, one of the famous Hamertons from Twickenham Riverside, when Marble Hill became a public park, he set up a little business down there on the riverside, renting out boats for people to row on the river. And people would approach from the Richmond side of the river and wave to come over. And so he would go over in a little boat, fetch them, and they'd come over and they'd hire one of his boats. And then he put up a sign that said ferry. And he started bringing people over who weren't renting boats, they were just using him for passage. The Earl of Dysart at Ham House, he no likey that, because he had his ferry just a little bit further down at Twickenham. And then there became the Battle of the Ferries, which went all the way to the House of Lords. Appeals were lost, appeals were won. It became very much one of those battles of, the people versus the peers. And there's a photograph, supposedly, of Walter Hamerton reading the letter, saying that he's won. And there we are, ending our little journey along Twickenham's riverside, back at Hamerton's Ferry, where you can safely take the ferry back to the Richmond side of the river. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Could you do that? Do that and I'll fix this off. Just getting...
Oh, do you know, I've just realised that I forgot to read that little bit from here, which was about Marble Hill House.
Just give it to people.
And it said, when the news broke that roads and sewers were being constructed in the grounds, articles and poems lamenting the impending destruction of the view from Richmond Hill appeared in local and London journals. So there we go. It's all in. If you want to read the full story, it's the 2001 edition of the Richmond History Society magazine. There we go.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
We're going to have questions now. So I've just distributed the two mics. So who would like to ask a question?
Oh, we have a gentleman in the front row.
Yeah, go for it. So who's got the... Al, can you... On this side. If you do this side and... All right.
Here we are.
David Williams, former leader of Richmond Council.
Hello there, I've heard of you.
Oh, thank you very much. Awful lot of people heard about me and have very different views. I was delighted that we had the naked ladies in the municipal garden, that it made a tremendous difference in, view, culture, everything else, having these Italian, late 19th century Italian statues there. And not only are they still there, the council was committed to looking after them, and we spent several £100,000 maintaining them and repairing them and getting some security to stop them being vandalized so easily, which I've never regretted. The intriguing thing about them is that one group of statues right by Riverside, right by the road, in the bottom right-hand corner as you look at them, has one of the naked ladies with the bottom sticking out over the wall directly opposite the vicarage first floor window.
It was a special request.
I don't know if it was a special request from the vicar. I don't think they were quite like that then. But obviously Rajan Tata had an argument with the vicar, and this was his revenge, I think. And numerous vicars have either enjoyed the view or been scandalized by the view in the last over 100 years. So the naked ladies did add a great deal to what was a nice municipal garden, but an even more interesting one after that.
And during the Second World War, talking about naked ladies' bottoms, the naked ladies were considered to be a kind of security threat, because you would have had, bombers tracking up and down the river. Finding the river as a bomber was a really important thing if you were kind of German bombers coming in. There were also in Twickenham, just by Richmond Bridge, there was the big munitions factory, I think. So during the Second World War, those bottoms to which you've referred were actually covered, not just the bottoms, everything else as well, in a grey sludge. So that if there were kind of lights from bombers, they wouldn't pick up a shiny white bottom and realise where they were.
There's another question down here, I think, out at the front. Good, wait, if you can wait for the mic. Sorry, there you go.
I'm not sure it's working.
Yes, it is.
Yes, you're on.
There were some lovely images and photos and throughout the talk.
Thank you.
There was one that I've not seen before, I don't think, which was a painting with St Mary's in the background, and it was a painting in 1820.
Oh, right, those early ones, yeah.
Do you know who that was by?
Do you know, I will have it in my notes somewhere. I'm pretty bad about putting stuff up, typing all those names up. But I would certainly be able to find out for you. I mean, the wonderful thing about being a local historian in this area is that it's such a much painted and much photographed part of the world, and especially when you had someone like Nelly Ionides, who was an incredible collector. I mean, she was a shell heiress, and shell was called shell because her father, who was one of the two brothers, the the Samuel brothers, who had set up Shell, collected shells. And so they called their oil company Shell. So she was an amazing collector of images of the borough, and a lot of what you see at Orleans House Gallery is part of her collection. And no doubt that image to which you refer, I will have plundered from the Ionides archive at Orleans House Gallery.
Another question? Oh, there's a lady there.
You said something about Betjeman and Church Street. I wonder whether you could say any more, how he got involved in that, and did he write any poems about it?
Right. Do you know, I don't know his poetry well enough to know that, but I do know that he was, after the Second World War, I think we all know he became very involved in highlighting what was happening to post-war England and the wrecking balls, if you like. There were plans from Richmond Council to not only demolish parts of the embankment that had been preserved by the Embankment Preservation Society in 1937, using the same using CPO, compulsory purchase order powers, and those powers were used most recently on Twickenham Riverside to take the Diamond Jubilee Gardens. They were taken by the council using compulsory purchase orders in order to kind of build the flats. At that same time, as well as the embankment, Church Street, the kind of riverside part of Church Street, was under threat. And I'm not sure how Betjeman got involved, but it was one of his sort of early projects, and it was a successful project. It was saved, and people say it kind of put a little bit of fire in his belly as to what could be achieved elsewhere. But I've got a huge amount of detail as to what he actually did. But he was a prominent figure that got involved.
Another question here in front.
Hello. I've got a question for both of you, actually. I live in Ham, and I often walk along the river, and at the western tip, you're looking across at a beautiful ornate balustrade, which is not in keeping with Cross Keys, the 30th block of flats. So there was obviously a grand house, and I wondered what that was, and if you've got a picture. My second one is to someone who might know, perhaps yourself, in the RHLS, and that is the change that's happening now. If you just look at Teddington, the history is gone already of, like, for instance, where we all know the lovely Python sketch that was performed on where Teddington Lock is.
Teddington Studios.
How much recording of what was there, even in our, even as we are now, and it's changed, what is going on now?
Well, I'll defer completely to Celia on that.
Over to you guys.
Well, do you know, rather interesting, I did have, this is a sort of edited version. You wouldn't believe it could be longer. Oh, it could be much longer. So where you're referring, I believe, to the 1930s development called Thames 8, and which is just, when you're on Twickenham riverside, you kind of get to Wharf Lane, you kind of can't go any further because there's a sort of large 1930s development block of flats. There was an older house on that site called Poulette Lodge, and that was pulled down in the 1920s because what was happening in the 1920s, you had York House was on the market for sale, Richmond House was on the market for sale, Poulette House was on the market, and a lot of these houses were on the market with a view to being demolished and housing developments. William Cunard in the late 1800s had been buying up, Orleans House, Mount Lebanon, and Marble Hill House with a view to doing development. So Richmond Council had bought Richmond House and York House, and then Richmond Council demolished Richmond House and did the swimming baths. Poulette House, which is where you've got that ornate balustrade, and I actually had a couple of images showing Poulette House with that ornate balustrade, and then the flats were built, but the ornate balustrade from the previous house remained. So when you do go on, your riverside walks in Richmond, Twickenham, wherever, there are all these kind of markers from the past that still remain. I mean, going on walks with Paul, I've done some of his Richmond Society walks, you feel a little bit like Sherlock Holmes, finding little brick walls and occasional things. But no, that was all knocked down. And you're absolutely right, the balustrade did belong to a large house that was previously on that site.
Probably got time for one more question, and I know that Celia's happy to mingle afterwards. But can I ask Simon, are there any ones from Zoom? How many people have you got on Zoom? 30. Very good. Great.
People, so people enjoyed it.
Great. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Zoom.
Any more questions? Oh, yes, there's a lady over there, and then we'll go to the downstairs.
Thank you. What was Eel Pie Island called originally?
Oh, you're very good. I planted her there for that question. Eel Pie Island had lots of really boring names. It was called Twickenham 8, rather obviously. It was called Parish 8, because at one point it was owned by St Mary's Church. The name, it was called Osia or Ossia, I'm never quite sure how to say that name. That name relates to reeds, because it's tidal, and as a kind of muddy pile, it would be exposed and covered by the tide, and reeds would be harvested to make baskets and so forth. The name Eel Pie Island kind of started to come into use in the early 1800s, and as I sort of said in the presentation, it was sort of linked to people at Westminster Pier doing their pitches to get people to come along, and it's called Eel Pie Island because supposedly Henry VIII, he had his palace at Richmond. I've got another mention of Richmond in. Seriously, I'm doing so well here. Yeah. Richmond Palace and Hampton Court, he'd go between the two on the river. Henry VIII, a rather large man, quite an appetite, get a bit peckish en route, and supposedly he would stop off at the inn on Eel Pie Island and partake of an eel pie. And the local watermen and lightermen were so honoured by this that a ceremony called the Landing of the Pie was initiated to mark the monarch's visit. Now, the only place that I found mention of this is in a brochure from the hotel. So we think it's a lovely bit of fabrication, but like all myths, it has, you know, we've got a king, we've got an inn, we've got eels in the river, you've got all of your ingredients to kind of spin that myth, but it was a marketing exercise, we believe. So yeah, so it was boring, and then it went very quirky.
Fantastic. So, Celia, thanks so much for a wonderful talk.
Not at all, you're very welcome.
I didn't know Sebastian Coe lived in the area, for instance. I've always known about Twining's house, and I've always been fascinated by that. But you mentioned the other tea, is it Pope's house, former Pope?
Yeah, that was
caddy,
also a tea merchant,
merchant.
but much later on.
Yes. So, can we put our hands together for Celia?
Thank you.
And here's a token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you, that's very
Learned your
sweet.
Richmond.
Oh, gosh, it's very heavy.
Yeah.
Thank you so